The words hit me like ice water in the face, shocking and cruel in their finality. Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, my daughter-in-law screamed, her perfectly manicured finger pointing toward the staircase of what had been my home for 37 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, still wearing the black dress from Thomas's funeral service just hours before. The scent of lilies from the funeral arrangements mixed sickeningly with the smell of coffee that had grown cold on the counter. My hands trembled as I gripped the doorframe, the wood smooth beneath my fingers from decades of my own touch. "Excuse me?" The words came out as barely a whisper, though inside my chest, something roared to Victoria, Vicky, as she insisted everyone call her, spun around, her blonde hair whipping dramatically across her shoulders. At 32, she was everything I had never been: tall, sharp-featured, and utterly without warmth. Her designer black dress hugged her figure perfectly, making her look more like she was attending a cocktail party than her father-in-law's funeral. "You heard me, Margaret." She spat my name like it tasted bitter. "The house belongs to Marcus now. We've already spoken to the lawyer." My son Marcus emerged from the living room, his face pale but his jaw set in that stubborn way that reminded me painfully of his father. At 35, he had Thomas's broad shoulders and dark hair, but where Thomas had possessed kindness in his eyes, Marcus had inherited something colder. "Mom," he said, not quite meeting my gaze, "we need to talk about the arrangements." "Arrangements?" I repeated, my voice growing stronger. "Your father was buried 3 hours ago, and you're talking about arrangements?" The living room beyond them was filled with the detritus of the reception: paper plates with half-eaten sandwiches, abandoned coffee cups, and sympathy cards that people had pressed into my hands with murmured condolences. Friends and neighbors had filtered out gradually, leaving me alone with what I had thought was my family. "The will reading is next week," Vicky continued, crossing her arms. "But Richard already explained everything. The house goes to Marcus, along with most of the estate. There's a small trust fund for you, enough for a nice apartment somewhere." My mind reeled. Richard Morrison had been Thomas's lawyer for over 20 years, a man I'd known since Marcus was in high school. Surely there had been some mistake. "Thomas would never," I began. "Thomas is dead," Vicky interrupted sharply. "And frankly, it's time you accepted that and moved on. We have plans for this place." I looked around the kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals, where Thomas had drunk his morning coffee while reading the newspaper, where we'd shared quiet moments over late-night snacks during Marcus's teenage years. Every surface held memories: the slight burn mark on the counter from when Marcus had tried to make breakfast in bed for me on Mother's Day when he was 12, the growth chart penciled on the doorframe tracking not just Marcus's height but that of every neighborhood child who'd played in our backyard. "Plans?" I asked faintly. Marcus finally looked directly at me, and in his eyes, I saw something that chilled me to the bone: anticipation mixed with impatience. "We're going to renovate. Open concept, modern fixtures. This place is so dated." Dated. 37 years of my life, and he called it dated. I walked slowly to the kitchen table and sank into my usual chair, the one facing the window that looked out over the garden Thomas and I had cultivated together. The roses were in full bloom, the pink ones he'd planted for our 10th anniversary, the white ones that matched my wedding bouquet. "When?" I asked quietly. "When what?" Vicky demanded. "When do you want me gone?" She exchanged a glance with Marcus, and I saw something pass between them: relief, perhaps, that I wasn't fighting this. 2 weeks should be plenty of time," she said briskly. "That'll give you time to sort through your things and find a place." 2 weeks. 37 years compressed into 2 weeks. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. The funeral had been long, filled with people telling me what a wonderful man Thomas had been, how sorry they were for my loss, how he'd lived a good life. A good life that, apparently, I was no longer welcome to be part of. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I need some air," I said, moving toward the back door. "Don't take too long," Vicky called after me. "We have more arrangements to discuss." The garden was bathed in late afternoon sunlight, golden and warm on my face. I Walked the familiar paths between the flower beds, past the vegetable garden where Thomas had grown tomatoes every summer, past the old oak tree where we'd hung a swing for Marcus when he was small. At the far end of the garden stood Thomas's workshop, a small building he'd constructed himself when we'd first moved here. It had been his sanctuary, filled with woodworking tools and half-finished projects. I hadn't been inside since the day he'd collapsed while working on what he'd called a surprise for Maggie. The door stuck slightly, it always had, but I pushed it open and stepped inside. The familiar smell of sawdust and wood stain enveloped me, along with something else I couldn't identify. Afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating workbenches covered with tools and wood shavings, and there, on the main workbench, sat an unfinished jewelry box. The wood was smooth and warm beneath my fingers, carved with delicate roses that matched the ones in our garden. A note was tucked under one corner, written in Thomas's careful handwriting, "For my Maggie, who deserves beautiful things to keep her beautiful memories in." I sank onto the stool beside the workbench, finally allowing the tears I'd held back all day to fall. But as I cried, something else began to build inside me, not just grief, but anger. A slow-burning fury that started in my chest and spread outward like fire. Thomas and I had built this life together. We had worked, saved, sacrificed, and dreamed together. We had raised Marcus in this house, supported him through college, celebrated his wedding, and welcomed Vicky into our family despite my private reservations about her coldness toward Thomas, and now, mere hours after we'd laid Thomas to rest, they wanted to erase every trace of the life we'd built. I picked up the unfinished jewelry box, holding it against my chest. Through the workshop window, I could see the house where Vicky was probably already measuring rooms for her renovations, where Marcus was probably already dividing up what he saw as his inheritance, but they had forgotten something important. They assumed I was the grieving widow who would quietly disappear, grateful for whatever scraps they threw my way. They didn't know about the woman Thomas had fallen in love with 40 years ago, the one who had put herself through nursing school while working 2 jobs, who had managed our household budget so carefully that we'd been able to pay off the mortgage early, who had fought the insurance company tooth and nail when they tried to deny Thomas's cancer treatments. They didn't know that before I became Thomas Morrison's wife, I had been Margaret Christine Kelly, a woman who had never backed down from a fight worth fighting. Standing up, I wiped my eyes and looked around the workshop with new purpose. Hidden behind the lumber rack, I spotted something that made my heart race: Thomas's old filing cabinet, the one he'd moved out here years ago to make room for a new computer desk in the house. Inside the top drawer, beneath layers of old receipts and warranty information, I found what I was looking for: a manila folder labeled Important Documents, MC. Thomas had always called me by my initials when he was being particularly tender or serious. With trembling fingers, I opened the folder. Inside were documents I'd forgotten about, papers Thomas had filed away years ago that suddenly seemed incredibly important. Property deeds, insurance policies, and at the very bottom, a copy of our will, not the one Richard Morrison had supposedly read, but one dated just 6 months ago. As I read, my anger transformed into something cooler and more dangerous: determination. The back door of the house slammed, and Vicky's voice carried across the garden. "Margaret, where are you? We need to discuss the timeline for cleaning out the basement." I carefully folded the documents and slipped them into my purse. Then I took one last look around the workshop, my eyes lingering on the half-finished jewelry box. "I'll be right there," I called back, my voice steady and calm. But as I walked back toward the house, I wasn't the same woman who had stumbled out here 20 minutes ago, broken and defeated. I was someone else entirely, someone who had just realized that the game was far from over, because they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated Margaret Christine Kelly Morrison, and that, I thought with grim satisfaction, was going to cost them everything. The house loomed before me, warm light spilling from the windows, looking exactly as it had for decades. But everything had changed in the space of 20 minutes. They wanted me to grieve, pack my bags, and disappear. Instead, I was going to fight. The screen door creaked as I pulled it open, stepping back into the kitchen where Vicky was now making a list on a yellow legal pad, her pen scratching aggressively across the paper. "Finally," she said without looking up. "I've been thinking about the furniture. Most of it is so outdated we'll probably just donate it. Though that china cabinet might be worth something." The china cabinet that had belonged to my grandmother. filled with dishes that had been passed down through 4 generations of women in my family. Actually, I said quietly, setting my purse carefully on the counter, I think we need to have a different conversation entirely. Something in my tone made both Marcus and Vicky look up sharply. What kind of conversation? Marcus asked warily. I smiled, not the gentle, accommodating smile I'd worn for years, but something sharper, more dangerous. The kind where we discuss what really happens next. Because they thought they held all the cards. They thought the game was over, they had no idea it was just beginning. The silence that followed my words stretched taut as a wire. Vicky's pen had stopped moving across her yellow legal pad, and Marcus had gone very still in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. What do you mean, what really happens next? Vicky asked, her voice carrying a note of warning that told me she was used to people backing down when she took that tone. I opened my purse and withdrew the manila folder, placing it deliberately on the kitchen table. The simple act felt monumental, like crossing a bridge I could never uncross. I mean, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, that perhaps we should all be very sure about what Thomas actually wanted before we start making plans. Marcus stepped fully into the kitchen, his brow furrowed. Mom, what are you talking about? Richard went over everything with us yesterday. The will is clear. Which will? I asked mildly, opening the folder, the color drained from Vicky's face so quickly. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. There's only one will, she said sharply, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. I pulled out the document I'd found in Thomas's workshop and spread it on the table between us. This is dated March 15th of this year. 6 months ago. The will Richard showed you yesterday, when exactly was it dated? Marcus leaned over to look at the papers, his face confused. I don't remember exactly. Richard handled all the details. How convenient, I murmured, scanning the document that Thomas had filed away so carefully. My heart began to race as I read provisions I'd forgotten we'd discussed, changes we'd made after Marcus's wedding when we'd both had concerns about. This is ridiculous, Vicky snapped, snatching the papers from the table. Anyone can fake documents. This is probably something you threw together this afternoon in some desperate attempt to what, Victoria? I interrupted, using her full name deliberately. To stay in the home I've lived in for 37 years? To keep the life Thomas and I built together from being demolished before his body is even cold in the ground. She flinched at the harshness in my tone, but I was just getting started. Let me tell you what I think happened, I continued, standing up and moving to the kitchen counter where I felt more in control. I think Richard Morrison showed you a will that was convenient for your plans. I think you've been counting on me being too grief-stricken to ask questions. And I think you severely underestimated who you're dealing with. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of Thomas when he was stressed. Mom, please. We're all emotional right now. Maybe we should wait until when, Marcus? I turned to face my son, really looking at him for the first time in months. When had he become this person? When had the little boy who used to bring me flowers from the garden turned into someone who could discuss disposing of our family furniture while his father's funeral reception plates were still sitting in the sink? Until I'm so worn down by grief that I'll accept whatever scraps you throw me? Until you've already started demolition on the life your father and I built? Vicky was still clutching the will, her knuckles white against the paper. This changes nothing. Even if this document is real, which I doubt, the house still goes to Marcus. You're still expected to make other arrangements. I smiled then, a cold expression that felt foreign on my face but surprisingly satisfying. Read section 4, subsection B. She looked down at the papers, her lips moving silently as she read. I watched her face change, watched understanding dawn followed quickly by fury. What does it say? Marcus demanded when his wife didn't respond. I answered for her, my voice calm and measured. It says that while the house is indeed left to you, Marcus, there's a condition. A very specific condition that your father insisted upon after your wedding. Marcus snatched the papers from Vicky's hands, scanning the legal language with growing alarm. I don't understand all this lawyer speak. What condition? It says, I explained patiently, that you inherit the house only if I predecease your father or if I voluntarily choose to relocate. If neither of those conditions is met, the house remains in my name until my death, at which point it passes to you. The kitchen fell absolutely silent except for the ticking of the antique clock Thomas had restored for our 20th anniversary. But, Richard said, Marcus began weakly. Richard Morrison has been the family lawyer for 20 years, I interrupted. But apparently, he's been serving someone else's interests lately. The question is whose? Vicky had gone very pale, but her chin lifted defiantly. You can't prove that document is legitimate. We'll contest it. With what grounds? I asked pleasantly. It's witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk's office. Thomas was very thorough about these things, as you well know. I moved to the kitchen drawer where we'd always kept important phone numbers and pulled out a small address book. In fact, I think I'll give Richard a call right now and ask him about this discrepancy. No. Vicky said quickly, then caught herself. I mean, it's late. Office hours are over. Richard's had this number for decades, I said, already dialing. He won't mind. As the phone rang, I watched my son and daughter-in-law exchange glances loaded with meaning I couldn't quite decipher. But whatever was happening here, it was bigger than a simple misunderstanding about inheritance. Morrison Law Offices, came Richard's familiar voice on the fourth ring. Richard, it's Margaret Morrison. I hope I'm not calling too late. A pause. Margaret. How are you holding up, dear? I'm managing, thank you. Richard, I have a question about Thomas's will. There seems to be some confusion about the terms. Another pause, longer this time. What kind of confusion? Well, Marcus and Victoria seem to think that I need to vacate the house within 2 weeks. But I have a copy of a will dated March 15th that suggests otherwise. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had been dropped. Richard. Yes, I'm here. Margaret, perhaps we should discuss this in my office. Tomorrow morning, if possible. That would be perfect. Shall we say 9 o'clock? Actually, could you make it 8? I have other appointments. I glanced at Marcus and Vicky, both of whom were watching me with expressions that ranged from worry to barely contained panic. 8 it is. Oh, and Richard? I'll be bringing my own legal representation. This time the pause was so long I could hear him breathing. Your own representation? Yes. You see, I'm beginning to think there might be a conflict of interest here. Someone has been giving my family some very interesting advice about my housing situation. When I hung up, the kitchen felt charged with electricity. Vicky was gripping the edge of the counter so hard her fingernails were white against the formica. You don't have a lawyer, Marcus said, but his voice sounded uncertain. Don't I? I asked mildly. 40 years in nursing, Marcus. Do you think I never made any connections? Never helped anyone who might be grateful enough to return a favor? The truth was, I did have a lawyer, Patricia Chen, whose daughter I'd cared for in the NICU 15 years ago when complications from premature birth had threatened her life. Patricia had told me then that she'd never be able to repay me for the extra hours I'd spent with little Emma, for the way I'd advocated for specialized treatments when other nurses might have given up. I'd never imagined I'd need to call in that debt, but desperate times called for desperate measures. Mom, Marcus said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I hadn't heard since he was a teenager asking to borrow the car. This is getting out of hand. We're family. Can't we work this out without lawyers and conflict? I studied my son's face, searching for any trace of the boy I'd raised, the young man who'd once brought me breakfast in bed on Mother's Day and told me I was the best mom in the world. That's exactly what I thought we were, Marcus. Family. But family doesn't throw each other out on the street before the funeral flowers have even wilted. We're not throwing you out, he protested. The house is too big for one person. And Vicky and we need the space. We're planning to start a family soon, and, are you? I asked quietly. Something flickered across Vicky's face, surprise, fear, anger. She wasn't pregnant. I'd spent enough years as a nurse to recognize the signs, and more importantly, to recognize their absence. That's not the point, Marcus stammered. Isn't it? Because it seems to me that's been the justification for a lot of decisions lately. The need for space, the importance of the next generation, the idea that I should gracefully step aside and make room for the future. I walked over to the kitchen window, looking out at the garden where Thomas and I had spent so many peaceful evenings. The roses were still blooming, beautiful and defiant in the fading light. Tell me something, Marcus. When did you and Vicky start planning this? Planning what? I turned back to face them. When did you start planning to get me out of this house? Because this isn't something you decided this afternoon. The way Vicky has the renovation plans already mapped out, the way you both seemed so sure about the legal arrangements, the way you had an answer ready for everything, this has been in the works for a while. Marcus opened his mouth to deny it, but Vicky put a hand on his arm. Don't, she said quietly, the single word hung in the air like a confession. How long? I asked. Vicky lifted her chin, and in her eyes I saw something I'd suspected but never wanted to believe. She'd never had any intention of sharing this house with me. Not ever. Since Thomas's diagnosis, she said flatly. Since we knew he wasn't going to recover. The words hit me like a physical blow. Since his diagnosis. You've been planning my eviction since we learned my husband was dying. It wasn't like that, Marcus said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. What was it like then? I demanded. While I was spending every day at the hospital, every night researching treatments and fighting with insurance companies, while I was holding your father's hand through chemotherapy and radiation, you were planning what to do with our home. You don't understand the financial pressures, Vicky began. Financial pressures? I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. What financial pressures? Thomas had excellent insurance through his job at the plant. We own this house free and clear. Our savings account is healthy, and his pension kicks in for me. I stopped, suddenly understanding. That's it, isn't it? The pension. The insurance payouts. The life insurance policy. Marcus looked like he wanted to sink through the floor, but Vicky held her ground. We have debts, she said defiantly. Student loans, credit cards, the mortgage. On our condo. Marcus's salary doesn't cover everything, and you saw Thomas's illness as an opportunity, I finished for her. A chance to solve your financial problems. It's not that simple, but it is that simple. You've been counting on me being too grief-stricken to fight, too overwhelmed to ask questions. You probably told Richard Morrison some sob story about family finances and convinced him to help you manipulate the legal situation. I picked up my purse, my hand steady now despite the rage building in my chest. Well, here's something that isn't simple, me. I am not the helpless widow you thought you were dealing with. I am not going to quietly disappear so you can solve your money problems by selling off my life. Where are you going? Marcus called as I headed for the back door. I paused, looking back at him. To make some phone calls. To prepare for tomorrow's meeting with Richard. To fight for what Thomas and I built together. Mom, please, 40 years, Marcus. 40 years I've been Margaret Morrison, devoted wife and mother. But before that, I was Margaret Christine Kelly, and she was never someone you wanted to cross. I stepped out into the garden, leaving them standing in the kitchen with their legal pads and their plans and their assumptions about who they thought I was, but as I walked toward Thomas's workshop, I wasn't thinking about revenge or even victory. I was thinking about something Thomas had said to me just weeks before he died, when the pain medication had made him philosophical and reflective. Maggie, he'd whispered, promise me something. Don't let them diminish you when I'm gone. You're stronger than you know, braver than you believe. Promise me you'll fight for what matters. I'd promised him then, thinking he was worried about me being lonely, about me losing myself in grief. Now I understood what he'd really been asking of me. I in the workshop, I sat down at his workbench and pulled out my phone. Patricia Chen's number was still in my contacts, listed under Emma's mom, because that's how I'd always thought of her. She answered on the second ring. Margaret? My God, I heard about Thomas. I'm so sorry, Patricia, I interrupted gently. I need to call in that favor. A pause. Tell me what you need. As I explained the situation, I could hear her taking notes, her legal mind already working on the problem. They're not just trying to manipulate inheritance law, she said when I finished. If they've been planning this since his diagnosis, if they've involved the family attorney in misrepresenting the will's contents, we might be looking at elder abuse, fraud, maybe even conspiracy. I just want to keep my home. Margaret, Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. I think you're going to do much more than that. From what you've described, your son and daughter-in-law have made some very serious mistakes. Very expensive mistakes. As we talked through the details, making plans for the morning's confrontation with Richard Morrison, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, hope, not the desperate hope of denial that had carried me through Thomas's illness, but the solid, determined hope of someone who knows what they're fighting for and has the weapons to win. Outside the workshop windows, the last light was fading from the garden. Inside the house, Marcus and Vicky were probably panicking, making phone calls of their own, trying to figure out how their carefully laid plans had gone so wrong that they'd made one crucial error in their calculations. They'd assumed that grief would make me weak. Instead, it was making me dangerous. Tomorrow, Richard Morrison was going to learn that some widows don't go gentle into that good night. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. I arrived at Richard Morrison's office at 7:50, 10 minutes early by design. Patricia Chen was already waiting in the parking lot, her silver sedan gleaming in the morning sun. She stepped out as I approached, a petite woman in her 40s with intelligent dark eyes and an immaculate navy suit that spoke of success and confidence. "Margaret," she said warmly, embracing me briefly. "I'm so sorry about Thomas. And I'm furious about what they're trying to do to you. Thank you for coming so quickly." She held up a thick briefcase. "I've been up since 4 a.m. reviewing the documents you faxed me. This is going to be more interesting than your son and his wife bargained for." The law office was housed in a converted Victorian mansion, all dark wood and heavy furniture that was supposed to convey tradition and trustworthiness. Richard had operated from this location for 30 years, building his reputation on estate planning and family law. I'd always found the atmosphere stuffy, but Thomas had trusted Richard implicitly. That trust, it seemed, had been misplaced. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, looked surprised to see us so early. "Mr. Morrison isn't expecting, he's expecting me," I said firmly. "Margaret Morrison, 8 o'clock appointment." She glanced nervously at Patricia, clearly uncertain about the protocol for unexpected legal representation. Let me check with Mr. Morrison." Through the frosted glass of Richard's office door, I could hear muffled voices, more than one. My suspicions crystallized into certainty. This wasn't going to be a simple clarification meeting. The receptionist returned, looking flustered. "Mr. Morrison will see you now. Both of you." Richard's office was exactly as I remembered: leather chairs, mahogany desk, walls lined with law books and framed certificates. But the atmosphere was electric with tension. Richard himself looked haggard, his usually perfect silver hair disheveled, his tie slightly askew, and sitting in the client chairs across from his desk were Marcus and Vicky. "Well," Patricia murmured beside me, "isn't this cozy?" "Margaret," Richard began, standing awkwardly behind his desk, "I wasn't expecting, weren't you?" I interrupted, taking the chair beside Vicky without invitation. Patricia settled beside Marcus, her briefcase clicking open with efficient precision. "I believe you know my son Marcus and my daughter-in-law Victoria," I continued pleasantly. "And this is my attorney, Patricia Chen." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Your attorney?" Marcus asked weakly. "Mom, this is just a family discussion, is it?" Patricia interrupted, her voice crisp and professional. "Because what I'm seeing here looks suspiciously like a conspiracy to defraud an elderly widow of her legal inheritance." Richard's face went white. "Now, see here, no one is suggesting." Patricia pulled a folder from her briefcase and placed it deliberately on Richard's desk. "Perhaps we should start with this. A copy of the will dated March 15th of this year, properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. The will that, mysteriously, wasn't the one you presented to the Morrison family yesterday." The silence stretched taut. Vicky was gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "There's been a misunderstanding," Richard began. "Has there?" Patricia's voice could have cut glass. "Because according to my research last night, you've been representing Marcus and Victoria Morrison in several financial matters over the past 6 months. Debt consolidation, bankruptcy consultation, and interestingly enough, estate planning advice that specifically concerned Mrs. Margaret Morrison's inheritance rights." My stomach clenched. "Bankruptcy consultation?" Marcus flinched as if I'd slapped him. "Mom, it's not what you think." "What I think," I said quietly, "is that you've been using your father's illness and death as an opportunity to solve your financial problems. What I think is that you convinced Richard to help you manipulate the legal situation to force me out of my home so you could sell it." "The debt isn't that bad," Marcus protested. We just need some temporary relief. How much? I asked. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Vicky shot her husband a warning look, but he was already crumbling under the weight of his guilt. 80,000, he whispered. I felt the air leave my lungs. $80,000? Credit cards, student loans, the mortgage on the condo, some investments that didn't work out, Marcus said miserably. Vicky thought if we could just get access to Dad's life insurance money and sell the house. You thought you could steal my inheritance to pay for your poor financial choices. I finished for him. Patricia was making notes in a legal pad, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes blazing with controlled anger. Mr. Morrison, she addressed Richard, would you like to explain your role in this scheme? Richard loosened his tie, his discomfort obvious. I was trying to help the family navigate a difficult situation by suppressing a legal will and presenting false information about inheritance rights. Patricia's voice was deadly calm. By violating your fiduciary duty to your client, who, I should note, was Thomas Morrison, not his son. The will they're referring to, Richard said desperately. There are questions about its validity. Thomas was under significant stress, his judgment may have been impaired by his illness. Thomas had terminal cancer, not dementia, I said sharply. His mind was clear until the very end. You know that, Richard. You were at the house just 2 months ago, discussing his funeral arrangements. Did he seem impaired then? The lawyer's shoulders sagged in defeat. Patricia leaned forward. Let me outline what I see here. A terminally ill man created a new will specifically to protect his widow from exactly this situation. His son and daughter-in-law, facing significant debt, conspired with the family attorney to suppress that will and present false information in order to force the widow from her home. This isn't a family dispute, gentlemen. This is felony fraud. Felony? Vicky spoke for the first time, her voice barely a whisper. Elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, suppression of legal documents, violation of fiduciary duty. Should I continue? Patricia's tone was conversational, which somehow made it more terrifying. Marcus was crying now, quiet tears of shame and panic. Mom, we never meant, we didn't want to hurt you. We thought you'd be happier in a smaller place anyway. The house is so big, so full of memories. Don't. The word came out sharper than I intended. Don't you dare try to convince me this was for my benefit. You wanted me out so you could cash in on 40 years of my life with Thomas. I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked Main Street. Below, the town was coming to life, people heading to work, children walking to school, the ordinary rhythms of life continuing while my world reshuffled itself completely. Here's what's going to happen, I said without turning around. Richard is going to produce the real will, immediately. He's going to file whatever paperwork is necessary to correct yesterday's misunderstanding. And then he's going to refer Marcus and Victoria to another attorney, because he has a conflict of interest. Mrs. Morrison, Richard began. I turned back to face the room. Furthermore, Patricia will be reviewing all of your interactions with my son and daughter-in-law over the past year. If we find evidence of additional misconduct, we'll be filing complaints with the State Bar Association and considering criminal charges. Criminal charges? Marcus looked stricken. Patricia nodded calmly. What you've attempted here isn't just unethical, it's illegal. Elder abuse is a serious crime, especially when it involves financial exploitation. Vicky finally found her voice again. We'll contest the will. We'll claim undue influence, diminished capacity. With what evidence? Patricia asked mildly. Your father-in-law was examined by multiple doctors throughout his illness. His medical records show no cognitive impairment. He was lucid enough to handle his own financial affairs, lucid enough to make funeral arrangements, lucid enough to update his will with proper witnesses and legal procedures. She paused, letting that sink in. On the other hand, we have documented evidence of your financial difficulties, records of your meetings with Mr. Morrison here to discuss ways around inheritance law, and testimony about your premature planning for Mrs. Morrison's eviction. What testimony? Marcus asked weakly. I smiled without warmth. Did you think the neighbors didn't notice Vicky measuring rooms and taking photos of the house while Thomas was still in hospice care? Did you think no one would remember the conversations at the funeral reception about renovation plans and timeline? The truth was, I hadn't spoken to any neighbors yet, but the stricken look on Vicky's face told me my guess had been accurate. Patricia closed her briefcase with a decisive click. Mr. Morrison, we'll expect the corrected documentation by close of business today. Mrs. Morrison will remain in her home, with full legal rights as outlined in her husband's actual will. Richard nodded miserably. Yes, of course. There was never any question, wasn't there? I asked quietly. Because yesterday you seemed very certain that I needed to vacate within 2 weeks. The lawyer couldn't meet my eyes. As we prepared to leave, Marcus stood up suddenly. Mom, wait. Please. I know this looks bad, but we're family. We can work this out. I studied his face, my son, my only child, the boy I'd rocked to sleep and worried over through fevers and heartbreaks and teenage rebellions. When had he become this person? When had love and trust been replaced by calculation and greed? Marcus, I said gently, you stood in my kitchen yesterday, hours after we buried your father, and told me to pack my bags. You planned this while he was dying. You involved lawyers and measured rooms and made lists of furniture to discard while I was holding his hand in the hospital. His face crumpled. I'm sorry. God, Mom, I'm so sorry. We were desperate, and Vicky said, don't blame this on your wife, I interrupted. You're a grown man. You made choices. I moved toward the door, then paused. But you're right about one thing. We are family. Which is why I'm not pressing criminal charges. Yet? Vicky's voice was sharp with fear. Yet. I confirmed. Patricia will be reviewing everything, and if we find evidence of additional financial impropriety, forged documents, misappropriated funds, anything else, then family loyalty won't protect you. Patricia held the door open for me. We'll also be placing a lien on the house to prevent any unauthorized sale attempts, and Mrs. Morrison will be changing all the locks today. Changing the locks? Marcus protested. But we have keys, had keys, I corrected. As of today, you're not welcome in my home uninvited. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but also liberating. For the first time in 24 hours, I felt like I was taking control instead of simply reacting. Outside the law office, Patricia and I stood by our cars in the morning sunshine. The confrontation had lasted less than an hour, but I felt like a different person than the one who'd walked in. That went better than I expected, Patricia said, pulling off her jacket in the warming air. They folded completely. What happens now? Now Richard files the correct paperwork, you change your locks, and we wait to see if they try anything else stupid. She paused, studying my face. How are you doing with all this? I considered the question. How was I doing? Yesterday I'd been a grieving widow, overwhelmed and manipulated. Today I was, what? I'm angry, I said finally. Angrier than I've been in years. But also, I searched for the right word. Free. For the first time since Thomas's diagnosis. I feel like I have some control over what happens next. Patricia smiled. Good. Because I have a feeling your son and daughter-in-law aren't done making bad decisions. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Hill, I thought about the conversation I'd need to have with myself tonight. The woman who'd walked into that law office this morning had been someone I didn't fully recognize, harder, more calculating, less forgiving than the Margaret Morrison I'd been for 40 years, but maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Thomas had asked me to fight for what mattered. I was beginning to understand that the first thing I'd needed to fight for was myself, my right to grieve without being victimized, my right to the life we'd built together, my right to decide what happened next on my own terms. The house came into view, solid and welcoming in the morning light. My house. My home. My sanctuary. Marcus and Vicky's car was gone from the driveway. For the first time since Thomas's death, I pulled into my own driveway without dread, without the sick anticipation of another confrontation. I was home. And I was staying. The real question now was what Marcus and Vicky would do next. Because people desperate enough to attempt fraud rarely gave up after one setback, but that was a problem for another day. Today, I was going to change the locks, call a few neighbors, and begin the process of reclaiming my life. After all, I had 40 years of experience being Margaret Morrison, devoted wife and mother, but I also had 62 years of experience being Margaret Christine Kelly, and she was just getting started. The locksmith arrived at noon, a weathered man named Dale who'd been in business longer than I'd lived in Cedar Hill. As he worked on replacing the front door deadbolt, neighbors began emerging from their houses with the peculiar radar that small towns develop for drama. Eleanor Hartwell from across the street was the first to approach, carrying a casserole dish as an excuse for conversation. At 74, she was sharp as a tack and had been watching the comings and goings in our neighborhood for decades. "Margaret, dear," she said, setting the dish on my porch table. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but there's been quite a bit of activity around here the past few days." "Oh?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what she meant. Eleanor glanced at the locksmith, then lowered her voice. "That wife of Marcus's was here Tuesday with a measuring tape and some man with a clipboard. Taking pictures of your garden, walking around the property line. Seemed awfully presumptuous, considering Thomas was still." She trailed off delicately. "Tuesday. Thomas had died on Sunday. While I was still making funeral arrangements, Vicky had been conducting property assessments." "Did you recognize the man?" I asked. "Real estate appraiser, if I had to guess. Had that look about him. Professional but hungry, you know?" Eleanor studied my face carefully. "Everything all right, dear? There've been some concerning rumors." Before I could respond, Dale the locksmith called out, "Mrs. Morrison? Could you come test this new key?" As I tried the fresh locks, I saw Eleanor watching with obvious relief. Whatever rumors were circulating, she clearly approved of my taking precautions. "Eleanor," I said, returning to where she stood, "would you mind telling me exactly what you saw? It might be important." Her eyes sharpened with interest. At her age, being asked to help with something genuinely significant was clearly appealing. "Tuesday morning, around 10 o'clock. Victoria pulled up with this appraiser fellow. They spent maybe an hour measuring the outside of the house, taking photos from every angle. She had a notebook and was writing things down constantly." Eleanor paused, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard. "But here's the thing that struck me as odd, she had keys. Let herself right into your house like she owned the place." Already, my blood chilled. Thomas had given Marcus and Vicky keys years ago for emergencies, but using them to let strangers into our home while he was barely cold in the ground was a violation so profound I could barely process it. "Did they go inside?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled. "Oh yes, spent another hour in there. I could see them moving room to room through the windows. Victoria seemed to be pointing things out, making more notes. I thought about valuable items in the house, Thomas's coin collection, my grandmother's jewelry, the antique furniture that had been in my family for generations. Had they been cataloging everything worth selling?" "Thank you for telling me this," I said sincerely. "It helps more than you know." After Eleanor left with promises to keep watching out for anything suspicious, I called Patricia. "They were in my house on Tuesday," I said without preamble when she answered. "With an appraiser." A pause. "While you were making funeral arrangements?" "While Thomas was barely buried. Eleanor saw them measuring, photographing, taking notes. They used their keys to let strangers into my home. That's breaking and entering, Margaret. And possibly burglary if anything's missing." I hadn't thought to check. I should inventory the house. Do it now, and document everything. Take photos of empty spaces if you find anything missing. This could be the additional evidence we need. I spent the next 3 hours walking through my own home like a detective, seeing it through the eyes of people who viewed it as inventory rather than a lifetime of memories. In Thomas's study, his collection of rare coins was intact but had clearly been disturbed. The display cases were slightly askew, and the magnifying glass he always kept in a specific position had been moved. In our bedroom, my jewelry box showed signs of being searched. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the pieces weren't arranged as I'd left them. Most disturbing was the discovery that someone had been through our financial documents. The home office filing cabinet was locked, but papers were slightly out of order in a way that suggested someone with access to the combination had been searching for specific information. I was photographing the disturbed files when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mrs. Morrison? This is Detective Ray Sullivan with Cedar Hill Police. I understand you've had some concerns about suspicious activity at your residence." I frowned. "I haven't called the police." "No, ma'am, but we received a call about potential elder abuse. The caller was concerned that you might be in danger from family members." My heart began to race. "Who called this in?" "Anonymous tip. But given the nature of the allegations, I'd like to come by and speak with you if that's all right. 20 minutes later, Detective Sullivan stood in my living room, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to dealing with family disputes. He listened carefully as I explained the situation, taking notes when I described finding the house had been searched. Anonymous tips about elder abuse are taken very seriously, he said when I finished. Especially when they involve financial exploitation. But I have to ask, is there any chance your son and daughter-in-law were concerned about your welfare? Sometimes families make difficult decisions thinking they're acting in someone's best interest. I almost laughed. Detective, they stood in my kitchen yesterday and told me to pack my bags because my husband was dead. They've been planning to evict me since his diagnosis 6 months ago. If that's concern for my welfare, I'd hate to see actual malice. He nodded thoughtfully. The anonymous caller mentioned something about you being forced to change lawyers and make hasty financial decisions while you were grieving. They seemed genuinely worried. The pieces clicked together suddenly. Did this anonymous caller happen to be an older woman? Maybe someone who's witnessed difficult family situations before. Detective Sullivan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested I'd guessed correctly. Eleanor Hartwell hadn't just been making conversation about neighborhood rumors, she'd been conducting her own investigation and decided to take action. I can't confirm the caller's identity, he said diplomatically. But I can tell you that what you're describing raises serious concerns. Breaking into a home to conduct unauthorized appraisals, searching through personal belongings, attempting to manipulate inheritance documents, these aren't gray areas. He pulled out a business card. I'd like you to call me if there are any other incidents. And Mrs. Morrison? That anonymous caller was right to be concerned. What happened to you yesterday wasn't normal grief counseling or family planning. It was targeted financial exploitation. After he left, I sat in Thomas's chair in the living room, trying to process how quickly my quiet life had become a police matter. 2 days ago I'd been a grieving widow planning to slowly figure out life without my husband. Now I was documenting crimes and changing locks and discovering that neighbors I barely knew were looking out for me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. There are things about Dad you don't know. Marcus. I stared at the message, ice forming in my stomach. Things about Thomas the First didn't know? What could Marcus possibly mean? Before I could decide how to respond, another message appeared. Meet me at Riverside Diner at 6. Come alone. This is about more than the house. My hands were shaking as I forwarded both messages to Patricia, then to Detective Sullivan. Within minutes, Patricia called back. Don't go, she said immediately. This has all the hallmarks of either an ambush or an attempt to manipulate you when you don't have backup. But what if there really is something about Thomas the First should know? Then, Marcus can tell you with lawyers present. Margaret, people who've committed fraud don't suddenly become trustworthy because they've been caught. But curiosity was eating at me. What secrets could Thomas have had? We'd been married nearly 40 years, had shared everything from childhood stories to final moments. What could Marcus know that I didn't? I thought about the filing cabinet in Thomas's study, the way the papers had been searched. Had they found something I'd missed? Some document that changed everything. At 5:30, against Patricia's advice and my own better judgment, I drove to Riverside Diner. It was a place Thomas and I had eaten countless times over the years, comfortable and familiar. If Marcus was planning some kind of confrontation, at least it would be in a public place with witnesses. He was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth and looking haggard. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his usually perfect appearance was disheveled. When he saw me, relief flooded his face. Mom, thank God you came. I wasn't sure you would after this morning. I slid into the booth across from him, keeping my purse close and my phone easily accessible. What do you want, Marcus? I want to explain. About Dad, about why we believed we were doing the right thing. The waitress approached, and Marcus ordered coffee for both of us. I waited, saying nothing, letting him fill the uncomfortable silence. Mom, did Dad ever tell you about his meetings with financial advisors last year? My chest tightened. What meetings? He was worried about leaving you provided for. With the medical bills and everything, he thought maybe the house was too much of a burden. He asked me to help him look into options. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. What kind of options? Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He wanted to explore selling the house and moving you somewhere smaller, more manageable. He was concerned about you being alone in such a big place, about the maintenance costs, about property taxes on a fixed income. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were documents I'd never seen, estimates from contractors about necessary repairs, property tax projections showing significant increases, and what appeared to be listings for senior living communities. He was planning to surprise you with options, Marcus continued, his voice earnest. He wanted to have everything researched so he could present you with a complete plan. But then he got sicker, and there wasn't time. I stared at the documents, my mind reeling. The house did need work, the roof had some loose shingles, the basement occasionally leaked, and the heating system was original to the house. But Thomas had never mentioned concerns about my ability to maintain it. If this is true, I said slowly, why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Why the deception about the will, the rushing, the demands that I leave immediately? Marcus's face crumpled. Because we screwed up. Because Vicky pushed, and I was scared about our debts, and we thought if we could just handle everything quickly, efficiently, it would be easier for you. No drawn-out decisions, no stress about selling the house yourself. By lying to me about my legal rights? By trying to take care of everything so you wouldn't have to. He leaned forward, his voice desperate. Mom, we never wanted to hurt you. We thought we were honoring Dad's wishes, protecting you from difficult decisions while you were grieving. I studied his face, searching for signs of deception. The documents looked legitimate, and it was possible Thomas had been concerned about my future without discussing it with me. He'd always been protective, always tried to shield me from financial worries, but something still felt wrong. Marcus, if your father wanted me to move somewhere smaller, why did he update the will to ensure I could stay in the house as long as I wanted? The question hung in the air between us. Marcus's expression flickered, just for a moment, and I saw something that looked like panic. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he realized how much the house meant to you. Or maybe, I said quietly, these documents aren't what they seem to be. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of each paper in the folder, watching Marcus grow increasingly uncomfortable. I'm going to have my attorney verify these, I said, closing the folder. If they're legitimate, if Thomas really was planning this, then we'll discuss it properly, with lawyers present and proper legal procedures. Mom, but if you've fabricated evidence to try to manipulate me into giving up my home, then you've moved beyond family disputes into criminal fraud territory. Marcus's face went white. You can't think I'd forge documents about Dad. I stood up, leaving money on the table for coffee I hadn't touched. 2 days ago, I couldn't have imagined. You'd try to evict me hours after your father's funeral. I'm learning there's a lot I never imagined you capable of. As I walked toward the exit, Marcus called after me. Mom, please. Just consider that maybe Dad knew what was best for you, even if you don't see it yet. I paused at the door, looking back at my son, this stranger who looked like the boy I'd raised but acted like someone I'd never met. Marcus, your father's last words to me were about fighting for what mattered and not letting anyone diminish me. If he'd wanted me out of our home, those wouldn't have been his dying concerns. Outside in the parking lot, I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The documents looked real, but the timing was too convenient. The explanations too neat. I called Patricia, describing the meeting and the papers Marcus had shown me. Bring them to my office first thing tomorrow, she said. I know experts who can verify whether those documents are legitimate or if they've been backdated or altered. And if they're real, then we deal with that. But Margaret, even if Thomas had concerns about the house, that doesn't justify the way they've handled this. Planning your eviction during his illness, manipulating legal documents, searching your home without permission, those are still serious crimes. As I drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Hill, I realized that the fight for my house had become something larger. It was a fight for the truth about Thomas, about our marriage, about whether the man I'd loved for 40 years had been planning to uproot me from everything familiar while pretending to support my choice to stay. The house stood solid and welcoming in the evening light. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I found myself wondering if I was fighting for the right thing. What if Thomas really had wanted me to leave? What if my stubborn insistence on staying was actually going against his final wishes? but as I unlocked the door with my new keys and stepped into the hallway where Thomas had carried me over the threshold as a young bride, I felt his presence so strongly it took my breath away. This was our home. Our life. Our sanctuary. Whatever games Marcus and Vicky were playing, whatever documents they might produce, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Thomas Morrison would never have wanted me to feel afraid in my own home, and that was exactly what his son was trying to make me feel. The real question was, how far would they go to get what they wanted? As if in answer to my thoughts, my phone buzzed with another text from Marcus. The house isn't the only thing you need to know about. Dad had other secrets. Meet me tomorrow, or you'll never learn the truth. I deleted the message without responding. Whatever secrets my family thought they were keeping, I was about to uncover them all. After all, 40 years of marriage teaches you how to find hidden things when you know where to look. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in the bed Thomas and I had shared for 37 years, staring at the ceiling and replaying every conversation we'd had during his illness. Had there been signs I'd missed? Hints that he wanted me to leave this house? The uncertainty gnawed at me worse than any physical pain. At 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep and padded downstairs to make tea. The kitchen felt different in the darkness, not threatening, exactly, but somehow unfamiliar, as if Marcus's accusations had shifted the very foundation of my understanding. I was sitting at the table, cradling my mug, when a sound from the basement made me freeze. A soft thud, like something being moved. My first instinct was to call 911, but then I heard it again, rhythmic, deliberate. Someone was down there grabbing the heavy flashlight Thomas kept by the back door. I crept to the basement stairs. The door was slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it earlier. My heart hammered as I descended the wooden steps, each creak seeming loud as gunshots in the silence. The basement was divided into several rooms, laundry, storage, and Thomas's old workshop area that he'd abandoned when he built the one outside. The sound was coming from the storage room, where we kept boxes of holiday decorations, old furniture, and decades of accumulated life. I clicked on the flashlight and nearly screamed. A figure was hunched over a stack of boxes, rifling through contents with practiced efficiency. In the beam of light, I could see it was a woman, blonde hair, expensive jacket despite the late hour. Vicky. She spun around, caught like a burglar in the act, which I supposed she was. Margaret. You scared me to death. I scared you. I kept the flashlight trained on her face, noting the way she squinted against the glare. You're in my basement at 3 in the morning, and I scared you? She straightened, trying to regain some composure. I can explain. I'm listening. Vicky glanced around the basement, clearly calculating her options. The only exit was behind me, and I was blocking it with 62 years of accumulated stubbornness. Marcus was right. There are things about Thomas you don't know. She gestured at the boxes around her. Things he wanted kept secret until after he was gone. So you decided to break into my house to find them? I have keys. She held up a familiar set, the ones I'd thought Marcus and she would return after this morning's confrontation. Had keys? Detective Sullivan is going to be very interested in this. Her confident mask slipped. You called the police? I called them yesterday about the break-in on Tuesday. I'll be calling them again about tonight. I pulled out my phone. With one hand, keeping the flashlight steady with the other. Wait. Vicky's voice took on a desperate edge. Before you do that, look at what I found. She pointed to an open box at her feet. Inside, I could see manila folders, papers, and what looked like photographs. My curiosity warred with my anger, but curiosity won. Show me. Vicky reached into the box and pulled out a thick folder. This was hidden behind the Christmas decorations. Thomas buried it deep, like he didn't want it found accidentally. She opened the folder, and even in the flashlight beam, I could see it contained official-looking documents. Insurance papers, medical records, and something that made my blood run cold, a restraining order application, dated 18 months ago. What is this? Vicky's voice was quiet now, almost gentle. Thomas was scared, Margaret. Scared of someone who'd been threatening him, threatening both of you. I snatched the folder from her hands, scanning the documents. The restraining order application was in Thomas's handwriting, requesting protection from someone named David Kelly. The name meant nothing to me, but the address listed was local, less than 5 miles from our house. Who is David Kelly? I asked. We were hoping you could tell us. Vicky pulled out another document. According to this, he claimed to be your brother. The world tilted. I don't have a brother. That's what Thomas told the police. But David Kelly had information about your family, about your childhood, things that convinced Thomas he might be telling the truth. I stared at the papers, my mind reeling. My parents had died when I was 22, and I'd been an only child. The idea of a brother, especially one threatening Thomas, was impossible. There's more. Vicky reached deeper into the box and pulled out a photograph. This was with the restraining order papers. The photo showed a man in his 60s with graying hair and familiar green eyes. My eyes. He was standing in front of a rundown house, holding what appeared to be a birth certificate. Thomas hired a private investigator, Vicky continued. He wanted to know if David Kelly was legitimate or just a con man. The investigation took months. And David Kelly is your half-brother. Same father, different mothers. Your father had an affair 20 years before you were born. I sat down heavily on an old chair, the flashlight wavering in my grip. A brother. A half-brother who'd been threatening Thomas, who'd somehow learned about our family, who'd been lurking in the shadows of our lives for months while I remained completely unaware. Why didn't Thomas tell me? Vicky's expression softened with what might have been genuine sympathy. Because David Kelly wasn't just claiming to be family. He was claiming you owed him money. A lot of money. She pulled out another document, bank records showing large withdrawals from Thomas's personal account over the past year. $50,000 in total, paid out in installments. Thomas was being blackmailed. David Kelly claimed your father left him something in his will, something that should have come to him instead of you. When Thomas refused to pay initially, Kelly started showing up at the house, at Thomas's work, making threats. The bank records swam before my eyes. $50,000. Money Thomas had never mentioned losing, money I'd never noticed missing. From accounts I'd stopped monitoring closely during his illness. So Thomas paid him to leave us alone. Thomas paid him to leave you alone, Vicky corrected. Kelly never threatened you directly, just Thomas. Said if Thomas didn't make things right, he'd find other ways to collect what was owed. I thought about Thomas's increasing anxiety in his final months, his insistence that I not answer the phone or the door when he wasn't home, his sudden interest in improving our security system. I'd attributed it all to his illness, to the vulnerability that comes with facing mortality. The private investigator's report is in there too, Vicky said, pointing to the box. Kelly's real, Margaret. He's your half-brother, and he's been planning something for months. With trembling hands, I pulled out the investigator's report. David Kelly, born David Andrew Kelly in 1960. Mother, Sarah Elizabeth Hoffman. Father, James Robert Kelly, the same name as my father, the same man who'd raised me as his only child while hiding the existence of another son. The report detailed David's criminal history, petty theft, fraud, several restraining orders from other victims of his schemes. But it also contained DNA evidence proving his paternal connection to me. Thomas was protecting you from this, Vicky said quietly. He knew the stress of learning about David would be devastating, especially while dealing with his cancer. He planned to tell you after he recovered, or if he didn't recover, he wanted Marcus and me to handle it. Handle it how? By selling the house and moving you somewhere David couldn't find you. Somewhere safe. The pieces suddenly clicked together with horrible clarity. The documents Marcus had shown me at the diner, the estimates for repairs and senior living communities, they weren't about Thomas wanting me in a smaller place. They were about Thomas wanting me hidden from a dangerous half-brother I'd never known existed. The will, I whispered. The updated will with conditions about me staying in the house, that wasn't about keeping me here. It was about making sure David Kelly couldn't force me out if Thomas died first. Vicky nodded. Thomas was terrified that Kelly would escalate after his death, that he'd come after you directly for whatever money he thought he was owed. The will conditions were meant to give you legal protection. I looked around the basement with new eyes. Seeing it as Thomas must have seen it, a hiding place for secrets too dangerous to share, evidence of threats too serious to burden a sick wife with during her husband's final months. Where is David Kelly now? We don't know. The investigator lost track of him 2 months ago, right before Thomas's condition got worse. He could be anywhere. I stood up, my legs unsteady but my mind clearing for the first time in days. So when you and Marcus demanded I leave the house, when you told me to pack my bags and move out immediately, we were terrified, Vicky admitted. Thomas made us promise that if anything happened to him, we'd get you somewhere safe immediately. We were supposed to tell you everything gently, gradually, but when you found that will and got lawyers involved, we panicked. You were trying to protect me. We were trying to honor Thomas's dying wish that you be safe from David Kelly. Her voice cracked slightly. Even if it meant looking like the villains, even if it meant you'd hate us. Thomas said your safety was more important than your opinion of us. The basement felt too small suddenly, the weight of revelations pressing down on me like the earth above. Everything I'd believed about the past 3 days had been wrong. Marcus and Vicky weren't trying to steal my inheritance, they were trying to save my life. We handled it badly, Vicky continued. We should have found a way to tell you the truth from the beginning. But we were grieving too, and scared, and Thomas had made the plan sound so simple when he was alive. I looked at the woman I'd thought was my enemy, seeing her clearly for the first time. She wasn't cold or calculating, she was exhausted, frightened, and carrying the burden of promises made to a dying man. The debt, I said. The $80,000 Marcus mentioned, was that related to the private investigator? Vicky nodded. Miserably. Thomas insisted on paying for everything, the investigation, enhanced security for the house, even the deposits on several senior living facilities he researched as safe options for you. He took out a second mortgage to fund it all, but never told you because he didn't want you to know how serious the threat was. A second mortgage. On the house we'd owned free and clear for 15 years. Thomas had mortgaged our security to protect me from a brother I'd never known existed. Show me everything, I said quietly. For the next hour, we sat on the basement floor going through box after box of documents Thomas had hidden. Police reports detailing David Kelly's escalating behavior. Photos of our house taken from across the street, surveillance photos that David had apparently been taking for months. Financial records showing the devastating cost of hiring private security and legal consultation, and letters. Dozens of letters David Kelly had sent to Thomas, each one more threatening than the last. Your wife's father owes me 50 years of child support, one read. Interest on that debt comes to nearly $200,000. Pay up or I'll collect from her directly. Margaret looks happy in that garden of hers, read another. Be a shame if something happened to spoil her peace. By the time we finished reviewing everything, dawn was breaking through the basement windows. I sat surrounded by the detritus of my husband's secret war, understanding finally why he'd seemed so tired, so worried, so protective in his final months. We need to call Detective Sullivan, I said finally. Vicky looked surprised. Are you going to press charges against Marcus and me? I considered the question. They'd broken into my house, lied to me about legal documents, and terrified me into thinking I was being victimized by greedy relatives. But they'd done it all while trying to carry out the dying wishes of a man who'd been too sick and too scared to handle the situation himself. I'm going to tell Detective Sullivan about David Kelly, I said. And then we're going to figure out how to handle this mess properly. As we climbed the basement stairs carrying boxes of evidence, Vicky paused. Margaret, I'm sorry. For everything. For the way we handled this, for not trusting you with the truth, for making Thomas's last wishes into something cruel. I looked at her, really looked, and saw a young woman who'd been thrust into an impossible situation, trying to protect someone she barely knew from threats she didn't understand. We all made mistakes, I said. But Thomas's biggest mistake was thinking he had to face this alone. But even as I said it, I wondered if that was true. Would I have been strong enough to handle the knowledge that a dangerous half-brother was stalking us? Would I have been able to make rational decisions about our safety while watching Thomas die? Maybe his protection had been one final gift, even if it had created this terrible mess. As we entered the kitchen with the morning sun streaming through windows, I realized the fight for my house had transformed into something much larger and more dangerous. David Kelly was still out there somewhere, still believing he was owed money from my father's non-existent estate, still potentially planning to collect what he thought was his due, and now, with Thomas gone, I was the only target left. The question wasn't whether I should stay in my house or leave. The question was whether anywhere would be safe enough to hide from a man who'd been planning his revenge for 62 years. Detective Sullivan arrived at 8 in the morning, accompanied by 2 other officers and a specialist from the county's elder abuse unit. By then, Vicky and I had arranged all of David Kelly's correspondence chronologically on the kitchen table, creating a timeline of escalating threats that painted a chilling picture of obsession and menace. Mrs. Morrison, Detective Sullivan, said after reviewing the first few letters, "Why didn't your husband report this to police?" I handed him the restraining order application Thomas had filed but never submitted. He tried. But look at the date, this was started 18 months ago, then abandoned. Detective Sullivan studied the incomplete paperwork. Any idea why he didn't follow through? Vicky answered before I could. The private investigator advised against it. Said David Kelly had a history of escalating when authorities got involved, and that a restraining order might make him more dangerous rather than less. The detective's expression darkened as he read through more of David's letters. The language grew increasingly specific about our daily routines, our financial habits, even details about Thomas's medical appointments that suggested extensive surveillance. "This man has been stalking you for over a year," he said grimly. "The photographs, the detailed knowledge of your schedules, this goes far beyond simple blackmail." I picked up one of the more recent letters, dated just 6 weeks before Thomas's death. "Margaret's morning walks are so predictable. Same route, same time, every day. A creature of habit, just like her father. He knows things about my routines that even I don't realize I have," I said, shivering despite the morning warmth. Detective Sullivan was already on his radio, calling for additional units and alerting the state police about David Kelly. Within minutes, our quiet kitchen had become a command center, with officers making calls and reviewing evidence while Patricia Chen arrived to ensure everything was handled properly from a legal standpoint. "The question now," Patricia said, settling at the table with her briefcase, "is what we do about immediate safety concerns while they locate this man." "I'm not leaving my house," I said firmly. "Thomas spent his final months arranging elaborate plans to move me somewhere safe, and look how that turned out. I'm staying where I belong." "Margaret," Detective Sullivan interrupted gently, "we have to consider that David Kelly might see your husband's death as an opportunity to escalate. He's been planning this for months, possibly years." Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown number, but something about the timing made my blood run cold. "Don't answer it," Vicky said quickly, but I was already lifting the phone to my ear. "Hello, Margaret." The voice was unfamiliar but carried an unsettling tone of intimacy. "I think it's time we finally met." Detective Sullivan immediately signaled for the other officers to trace the call while I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who is this?" "Your brother, of course. Though I suppose Thomas never mentioned me." Typical, the man could never face uncomfortable truths. "What do you want?" David Kelly's laugh was cold and calculating. "What I've always wanted. What our father owed me. 50 years of child support, plus interest, plus compensation for a lifetime of being denied my rightful place in the family." I looked around the kitchen at the faces watching me, Detective Sullivan with his hand on his weapon, Vicky pale with fear, Patricia taking rapid notes. All of them were depending on me to handle this conversation without escalating the situation. "Our father died over 20 years ago," I said carefully. "Whatever you think he owed you, whatever I think?" David's voice rose dangerously. "I have his original will, Margaret. The one where he left me half his estate before your mother convinced him to change it. I have documentation of every dollar he spent on your education, your wedding, your precious perfect life while I grew up in foster care." The officers were frantically working their equipment, trying to pinpoint his location. Detective Sullivan held up 5 fingers, then 4, then 3, asking me to keep him talking. "If you have legal documents," I said, "then we can discuss this through lawyers. I'm done with lawyers. I'm done with private investigators and restraining orders and all of Thomas's elaborate schemes to keep me away from what's mine." His voice turned venomous. "Did you know your devoted husband offered me $100,000 to disappear? 100,000, as if I'd take pennies on the dollar of what I'm actually owed." Detective Sullivan was nodding urgently. "They were getting close to a location. What do you want from me, David?" "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything you thought was yours. I want you to know how it feels to be cheated out of your rightful inheritance." The line went silent for a moment, and I heard what sounded like a car door slamming. "I'm in your driveway, Margaret." Come outside, and we'll settle this face to face. The phone went dead. Through the kitchen window, I could see a rusted pickup truck parked behind my car. A man was getting out, tall, thin, with graying hair and the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. Despite everything, seeing him felt like looking at a ghost of my father. "Nobody goes outside," Detective Sullivan commanded, drawing his weapon. "Mrs. Morrison, stay away from the windows." But David Kelly wasn't waiting for an invitation. The front doorbell rang, followed immediately by pounding on the door. "Margaret," his voice carried through the wood. "I know you're in there. We're family, don't make this harder than it has to be." Detective Sullivan positioned himself by the front window while the other officers took up positions around the house. Through the curtains, I could see David Kelly standing on my front porch, the porch where Thomas and I had shared morning coffee, where we'd watched sunsets and planned our retirement. "He doesn't have any weapons visible," one officer reported quietly, but something in David's stance, in the way he kept looking around the property with proprietary interest, suggested this wasn't going to be resolved through simple conversation. "David." I called through the door, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "I'm listening. Tell me what you think I owe you." "Open the door, Margaret. Let's discuss this like the family we are." Detective Sullivan shook his head emphatically, but I found myself moving toward the front hall anyway. This man had terrorized Thomas during his final months, had forced my husband to take out secret mortgages and hire private investigators. Had turned what should have been peaceful final months into a nightmare of anxiety and fear. "I'll talk to you through the door," I said firmly. "Say what you came to say." "Our father promised me half of everything when I turned 18, David's voice was muffled but clear. "Instead, he cut me out completely and gave it all to his precious legitimate daughter. The house, the business, the savings, everything. That should have been partly mine." I pressed my back against the door, feeling the weight of revelation. "What business?" "My father was a store clerk." David's bitter laugh carried through the wood. "A store clerk who owned 3 buildings downtown, who had a substantial life insurance policy, who left an estate worth nearly $500,000. In 1985. Money that should have been split between his 2 children." The world seemed to tilt again. My father, whom I'd remembered as a hardworking but modest man, had been wealthy? The small apartment where I'd grown up, the careful budgeting, my mother's constant worry about money, had it all been pretense? "That's impossible," I said. "Check the county records, Margaret. Check the probate files. Your father owned more than you ever knew, and your mother made sure I didn't get a penny of it." Patricia was already on her phone, presumably researching property records and estate filings. Detective Sullivan continued watching through the window, his weapon ready. But not yet raised. "Even if that's true," I called through the door, "it doesn't give you the right to threaten me. I was 22 when Dad died. I didn't make those decisions." "No, but you benefited from them. Every dollar that put you through nursing school, every penny that helped you buy this house, every advantage you've had in life, it was built on money that was stolen from me." There was truth in his words, even if his methods were wrong. If our father really had cut David out of his will, if I'd unknowingly inherited wealth that should have been shared, then perhaps I did owe him something, but not this way. Not through threats and stalking and terrorizing a dying man. "David," I said, my voice gentler now, "if Dad really did wrong you, if you were cheated out of an inheritance, then let's fix it properly. Through the courts, with lawyers, the right way." "The right way?" His voice rose to a shout. "I've been trying the right way for 40 years. Every lawyer tells me it's too late, every court says the statute of limitations has passed. Well, I'm done with the right way." The pounding on the door resumed, harder now, and I could hear him trying the doorknob. Detective Sullivan moved closer, speaking into his radio. "Suspect is attempting to force entry. Moving to intercept." But before he could act, David's voice changed completely, from angry to defeated, from threatening to broken. "I just want what should have been mine, Margaret. I just want someone in this family to acknowledge that I existed, that I mattered. That I deserved something more than foster homes and food stamps and growing up thinking my father didn't want me." Through the door, I could hear him crying, harsh, bitter sobs of a man who'd carried rage and hurt for 62 years. "I know about loneliness, David," I said softly. "I know about feeling like you don't matter. But this isn't the way." "Then what is the way?" How do I get back 40 years of being nobody? How do I recover from a lifetime of thinking I wasn't worth a father's love? I looked around at the faces watching me, at Detective Sullivan with his hand on his weapon, at Vicky who was crying quietly, at Patricia who was still researching on her phone. All of them were waiting for me to make a choice that would determine how this ended. "Open the door, Margaret," David said, his voice exhausted. "Now. Please. Let me see my father's daughter. Let me understand what made you worth choosing over me." Detective Sullivan shook his head urgently, but something in David's tone had shifted. The rage was gone, replaced by something that sounded like desperation and genuine grief. "If I open this door," I said, "you have to promise me something." "What?" "That. We'll settle this without violence. That we'll find a way to address the past without destroying the future." A long pause. "I promise." Against every instinct and Detective Sullivan's urgent whispered protests, I unlocked the door and opened it slowly. David Kelly stood on my porch looking older and more fragile than his surveillance photos had suggested. His clothes were worn, his face lined with years of hardship, and his eyes, my eyes, were filled with tears. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. "Hello, David." For a moment, we simply looked at each other, two children of the same father, separated by decades of secrets and lies, finally meeting face to face. "You look like him," David said finally. "More than I do. Maybe that's why he chose you." "He didn't choose me over you, David. He probably never thought you'd find out about the inheritance, never imagined you'd grow up believing he didn't want you." David's face crumpled. "But he did know. I wrote to him when I turned 18, when I aged out of foster care. I asked him for help, for some connection to family. He never answered." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My father had known about David, had received letters from his abandoned son, and had chosen silence instead of acknowledgement. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "That was wrong. You deserved better." "I don't want your pity," David said, but there was no heat in the words. "I want justice." Patricia appeared beside me, having finished her research. "Mr. Kelly, I've been reviewing the estate records. You're right, your father did own significant property that wasn't disclosed in the probate filing Margaret received." David's eyes sharpened with vindication. "I told you." "However," Patricia continued, "the statute of limitations for contesting the will expired decades ago. Legally, Margaret has no obligation to share the inheritance." "Legally," David spat. "But," I interrupted before he could explode again, "legally isn't the same as morally." I looked at this broken man who shared my father's eyes and my stubborn chin, who had spent a lifetime believing he was unwanted and unloved because of decisions made before I was even born. "David, I can't give you back your childhood or your relationship with our father. I can't undo 40 years of hurt. But I can try to make the financial part right." Detective Sullivan stepped forward. "Mrs. Morrison, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," I said firmly. Not because he threatened me, but because it's the right thing to do. I turned back to David. "If Patricia's research confirms that you were cheated out of an inheritance, I'll split the current value with you. Not because I'm afraid of you, but because we're family, and family takes care of each other." David stared at me as if I'd spoken a foreign language. You'd actually do that?" "On one condition. You get help for the anger and the drinking I can smell on your breath. You stop threatening people and start dealing with your pain the right way. And you never, ever terrorize anyone the way you terrorized Thomas." For a long moment, David stood silent on my porch. Then his shoulders sagged, and he seemed to shrink before my eyes. "I hated him," he whispered. "Thomas. Because he had everything I wanted, your love, a real family, a place where he belonged. I wanted to hurt him the way I'd been hurt." "He's gone now," I said gently. "You can't hurt him anymore. But you can choose not to hurt anyone else." David nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "I'm tired, Margaret. I'm so tired of being angry." 3 hours later, we sat around my kitchen table, David, Detective Sullivan, Patricia, Vicky, Marcus, who had arrived after frantic phone calls, and me. The crisis had passed, replaced by the complex work of addressing decades of family secrets and financial entanglements. Patricia had confirmed that our father's estate had been substantially undervalued in probate, with several properties transferred to my mother through questionable legal maneuvers. The moral case for sharing the inheritance was clear, even if the legal case had expired. "I'll need time to liquidate some assets," I told David, "but I can have 50,000 within the month, and we'll work out payment plans for the rest." David looked overwhelmed. "I never thought. I hoped, but I never really believed you'd listen." "Thomas would have wanted me to do the right thing," I said. "Even after what you put him through, he would have wanted me to help family." Marcus, who had been silent through most of the discussion, finally spoke. "Mom, are you sure about this? That's your security you're talking about giving away." I smiled at my son, seeing worry instead of greed in his expression for the first time in days. "Marcus, I've lived in this house for 37 years. I've had a good marriage, a successful career, and enough financial security to be comfortable. David has had none of those things, partly because of choices our father made before either of us had any say in the matter." "It's still your money legally," Vicky pointed out. "And it's still the right thing to do morally," I replied, Detective Sullivan had been taking notes throughout our discussion. "Mr. Kelly, you understand that accepting this arrangement means no more threats, no more surveillance, no more contact except through legal channels?" David nodded. "I understand. And I'm sorry. For everything. For Thomas, for scaring you, for handling this so badly." As the afternoon wore on and the details were worked out, I found myself studying this brother I'd never known existed. He had our father's stubborn streak and our mother's quick temper, but underneath the anger and desperation, I could see glimpses of the boy he'd been, abandoned, frightened, and desperately wanting to belong somewhere. "David," I said as he prepared to leave, "after we get the financial arrangements settled, would you like to come for dinner sometime? I have photo albums, stories about Dad you might want to hear." He looked stunned. "You'd want that? You're my brother. Of course I'd want that." For the first time since he'd arrived, David Kelly smiled, a real smile that transformed his whole face and made him look less like a threatening stranger and more like family. After everyone left, the house felt different again, not violated or threatening, but somehow more complete. I sat in Thomas's chair, holding the jewelry box he'd never finished, and thought about the strange turns life could take. Thomas had spent his final months trying to protect me from David's anger, never imagining that the solution might be as simple as acknowledging David's pain and addressing the injustice that had caused it. Maybe that was the difference between men and women, or maybe it was just the difference between Thomas and me. He'd seen a threat to be neutralized. I'd seen a wounded brother who needed healing. Both responses had their place, but I was glad mine had worked. 3 months later, David came for Christmas dinner, sober, employed at a local garage, and slowly learning how to be part of a family. Marcus and Vicky had moved into their own home with a mortgage they could actually afford, using David's forgiveness and my financial help to start fresh. The house felt alive again, filled with conversation and laughter and the ordinary chaos of family life. Thomas's jewelry box sat finished on my dresser, completed by David as a gesture of apology and healing. Inside, I kept letters, not threatening ones this time, but the tentative correspondence between siblings learning to trust each other. Sometimes I wondered what Thomas would think of how everything turned out. Would he approve of my choice to help David, or would he worry that I was too trusting, too forgiving? But then I'd remember his final words to me about fighting for what mattered and not letting anyone diminish me. I'd fought, all right, not just for my house or my inheritance, but for the possibility that broken families could be healed, that old wounds could be addressed with compassion instead of combat. The house remained mine, but it had become something more than just my sanctuary. It had become proof that even the deepest family fractures could be repaired with patience, understanding, and the courage to do what's right instead of what's easy. After all, home isn't just about the building you live in. It's about the people you choose to let inside, the relationships you're willing to fight for, and the love you're brave enough to extend even when it's been wounded. Thomas had been right about one thing. I was stronger and braver than I'd known. I just hadn't realized that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in defending what you have, but in sharing it with someone who needs it more. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.